Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Jonathan Bennett joins me. We're going to be talking about current news. It's a little unusual, but you're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned. FLOSS Weekly is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Stay in control when it comes to your company's access points and authentication. LastPass makes enterprise-level security simple. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Jonathan Bennett. Episode 569, recorded March 11th, 2020. News Potpourri. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. Bad data happens to good companies. That's why 10,000 businesses count on Melissa for clean, reliable address data. Get started today with 25,000 records cleaned for free. That's a $75 value at melissa.com/twit. And by ExpressVPN. Protect your online privacy with one click. For 3 extra months free with a 1-year package, go to expressvpn.com/floss. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stitch.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, little projects, projects you may be using every day and not aware of it, projects you might want to play with right after this show. I don't think today is going to be either one of those, but joining me once again is my lovely and talented co-host, Jonathan Bennett. Jonathan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I feel like I'm becoming something of a fixture on FLOSS Weekly.
I believe you're still getting the majority of all of the co-host slots in the last, I guess, probably 2 years. So I think probably it adds up quite quickly.
Yes.
We normally have a wonderful guest each week. This week there was some snafus. I will just leave it at that and not really point fingers to anybody. So this week is going to be a bit of an unusual show. And Jonathan, you're helping me out with this one. We're going to be doing news topics, things that are happening around the net, particularly around like coronavirus, things like that, and other like security topics that you're familiar with. And you're going to be mostly driving this show, so I'm mostly going to be just an interviewer asking you questions. So that's kind of our relationship today. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and of course, because it's FLOSS Weekly, we're going to be doing the news topics that are concerning open source software. We're going to look at the open source angle on all of these. But yeah, that's what we're doing. Mostly
that, yes, mostly. And unfortunately, I dashed out of my Tijuana apartment last week a little too fast. So as you noticed at the beginning of the show, I didn't have my normal fez on. It's because I can't do a confessional properly. And so it's a little weird today. I'm also using my webcam is also down there in Tijuana, so I'm using the FaceTime webcam on my laptop, so it's a little bit less quality than it normally is. But I do have my big blue Yeti, which is something I don't have when I'm down in Tijuana. So that'll all get reset when I go back to Tijuana in a week and a half. Then I'll be able to get those all back together. So is there anything you want to say before I read the first ad and get into the show?
No, nothing comes to mind. We'll certainly get into it once we get into the rest of the show. So go for it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about this very important message, because this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by the leader in address verification, Melissa. Every address is covered from Adelaide, Australia to Zipaqueta, Colombia, and everywhere in between. We all know there's nothing good about bad data. It costs money, hurts sales, and decreases customer satisfaction. If bad addresses, duplicate records, and bouncing emails are hurting your business, isn't it time to come clean with Melissa? Delta Faucet, Z1 Motorsports, and Car2Go use Melissa. You should too. Delta Faucet was able to improve their call center processes with global address auto-completion. Melissa was able to reduce the fraudulent e-commerce transactions for Z1 Motorsports by 90%. Melissa provides a full spectrum of data quality protection for your customer data. Verify postal addresses, mobile numbers, and email addresses. Update the addresses of customers that have moved and eliminated duplicate records. Gain additional customer insight into your data with Melissa's analytics. Easily build address verification and customer data validation into your custom application using Melissa's APIs, CRM cloud connectors, and e-commerce plugins, or upload your customer file for a quick data cleanse. Melissa is serious about securely managing their data. They continually undergo independent security audits to reinforce their commitment to data security, privacy, and compliance requirements. SOC 2, HIPAA, and GDPR compliant. Mailers spend about $20 billion annually in undeliverable mail. Do not lose customers or cash. Make every address count. Bad data happens to good companies. That's why 10,000 organizations worldwide trust Melissa to get their customer data clean and accurate. Get started today with 25,000 records cleaned for free. That's a $75 value at melissa.com/twit. That's melissa.com/TWIT, or call 1-800-MELISSA to find out more. And we thank Melissa for their support of Floss Weekly. Let's go ahead and get into it. What's our first topic there, Jonathan?
So the one that I picked for on the top is the Supreme Court is going to be hearing arguments in the big Oracle versus Google case. And it's important because they're going to try to figure out whether or not APIs are copyrightable.
Ooh, and this is important because it's something that's affecting Android. It's actually part of the reason I think that Google's actually working on Fuchsia, but I only have a hint that that's actually true.
I'm sure that was part of that thought process. You know, Google, as big as they are, has to have a plan B for if this really goes against them. The big thing, though, is it impacts all of us. It's not just about Android. It's about anytime someone re-implements APIs, languages, any of those things. And so there's some interesting ramifications. The Ars Technica article that I'm referencing, they talk about something that I had never thought of, and that is the structured query language. Did you know that was originally put together by IBM? IBM published a white paper about it, and surprise, surprise, Oracle, based on that white paper, made their own implementation of SQL.
Yeah, and it was originally called SQL, which is why people still call it SQL, which annoys me because that's not the name of it. So it's but when IBM did it, it was SQL. And let's back up a step. So what is an API?
Oh, sure. So an API, let's see, what does that actually stand for? Is it something programming interface? It's essentially application programming interface.
I think so. Yeah.
I think you're right. It's essentially a set of functions and calls that allows you to do what you need to do with the language. I mean, it's things as simple as maybe I think in Java there's an API call that's sum open parentheses and then your two numbers and then close parentheses, and that's one of the ways that you can add two integers or values together. And so it's these really basic things that you kind of have to be able to do do anything with the language.
And as I understand this, the Supreme Court thing, what's actually being decided is that back when Sun was a separate organization and not part of Oracle, there was a sort of a handshake agreement between Sun and whoever owns the APIs, whoever owns Java at the time. Well, Sun owned Java, right?
Sun owned Java, and it was Google.
Yeah, and they basically said, and Google, Google then went and used it. And there was a handshake agreement between Google and Sun saying, yeah, you can go ahead and use all of the Java APIs. That's fine. But there was never a formal agreement for that. And then when Oracle bought Sun, they went, oh, we have some intellectual property here now that we can go after Google with. And so that's been the fight here. The fight has been that there was never a formal agreement between Sun, which became Oracle, and Google. And so Google's been using these APIs in Android and a few other things. And now they've been back and forth in court. I don't remember all the gyrations of this, but this is interesting that it's finally coming up to the Supreme Court. So hopefully this will all get sorted out. So it'll be fun seeing how that comes out.
The first court that took a look at it, I don't remember if the judge learned how to program to be able to be intelligent about the case, or if he already knew some programming. But the judge actually knew his stuff and looked at it and went, well, an API is just like a recipe. It's not a copyrightable thing at all. So there's not even a case here. And I don't remember how many lines of code it was decided that Google actually copied out, but it was like 35 or 40 lines of code that actually got copied. And they said it's so trivial, it's fair use. And of course, a lot of us went, oh, well, that's good for all of us because, of course, APIs can't be copyrighted. There would be a huge problem if they could. This would make a lot of things more difficult. And so people are looking at it.
As I recall, it's only just the fact that it's the .h file. You have to comply with the .h file to be able to have people call you. Right. So it's like here's the .h file, which has to be a certain shape in order for people to call you and to be compatible with other people's code. And that was what was copied. So they copied the .h file, which of course, it's technically a copy, but you can't change that. It's the interface. It's how people are going to be able to call you from everywhere else.
Yeah, so we're all watching the Supreme Court case because there's I guess there's three possible outcomes. Sure. I would consider the best case outcome to be the Supreme Court looks at this and goes, APIs, those .h files, are recipes for source code.
Right.
Copyright just doesn't even apply to them. The other way that they could look at it is, well, okay, copyright might be able to apply to them, but because of how all of this works, it's fair use to be able to use them. Right. And that would work, but the whole fair use doctrine is confusing and a mess anyways. And then I guess the third possibility is they completely side with Oracle on this and say, Oracle, you're right. And then, the whole software world's hair is on fire because this rule that we've assumed for years and years suddenly changed out from under us.
Yeah, I mean, we can't make it illegal to publish a .h file and use a .h file, because otherwise the whole concept of being able to have compatible software breaks.
Yes, it would be decidedly bad. We could just say that it would be bad.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to say on that before we move on to the next topic?
No, I think we covered that pretty well.
I think we hammered it pretty well. So what's Docker reimagines itself? What's that about?
So Docker, back a few months ago, sold off all of their enterprise offerings. And I don't remember the company that they sold it to. But basically all the things that they were doing that was making them money, they let go and they sold. And so everyone was we were scratching our heads going, well, who is Docker the company now? And they apparently were doing the same thing, asking themselves that question. And they have decided that they are now returning to their developer roots. They've decided to focus the remaining business back on developers. They are a developer tooling company now.
And what does that? What does that mean?
That's a really good question. I have not seen an answer to what that means besides, hey, we found some buzzwords that we can use.
Wow.
I find it interesting, though, because Docker is kind of in this same place that a lot of open source projects are, and that is, how do we actually, we've got this really cool software. How do we actually make money for it? What is a business model that makes sense for us? And it'll be interesting to see if Docker has actually figured that out or not.
And over the 13 years of the show, I've seen so many different models of how people have tried to make money. And I've seen a lot of models that I know Simon Phipps gets mad at because it's open core. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, how do you make money giving stuff away? This is always a puzzle. When I tell my friends about free software, they're always like, well, how do you make money at that yet then? So it's, well, you sell services, you sell platform, you sell, you sell customization, you do something. I wonder which way Docker's going to go on this.
Well, one of the problems that they've run into is, so Docker and this idea of containerization, of course, it kind of shook the whole industry because it allowed things like Kubernetes. Well, Kubernetes is now where the new hotness is. Everybody's excited about Kubernetes. And the platforms like them, and that puts Docker in this really weird place where they are foundational technology to what we're all doing, but they're not in the limelight anymore because everybody has moved on to Kubernetes and are thinking about that side of it. And so it's weird. It's put Docker in this place where it's super important that they continue doing what they're doing and that the Docker project continues to be maintained and we get security updates, things like that. But nobody's talking about Docker anymore.
Is Kubernetes required Docker? Is that still part of the process?
I'm not sure. I've never had an application that I needed to scale up to the point where I wanted to use Kubernetes. I've used Docker. I've used raw Docker a few times. So I'm actually not sure the answer to that question.
I know there's containers involved in Kubernetes somehow, but I'm not sure whether Docker is the only kind of container that is allowed there. But I think there's other kinds of containers that can go into Kubernetes. But now I'm showing my ignorance, and I should probably shut up because I don't want my audience to think of how stupidly ignorant I actually am about this stuff. I know that my clients are using Kubernetes, so I'm pretty happy with that. But I think Docker's involved somehow, but I'm not exactly sure how.
Yes. So I'll give the dirty secret away. When we cover this many topics in a show, we don't have time to deep dive into all of them. So
sure. We can just keep moving forward. Yes. Right. I like the next topic, though. Let's move on to that, which is conferences doing virtual or delayed. So, coronavirus, big thing. The COVID-19, big issue with a lot of people. A lot of conferences are canceling or going virtual. What are some of the ones you've listed here?
So one of the big things that first caught my attention is this doesn't just apply to the mobile conference, the big one that got canceled. This doesn't just apply to E3, which just in the last few minutes got officially announced that it's canceled. This applies to all of the open source conferences and the Linux conferences. Right. Speaking of Kubernetes, KubeCon is one of the ones that got postponed. SUSECon is postponed. The Southeast Linux Fest, the Cloud Foundry Summit, a bunch of these are pretty much all either postponed or going virtual, which is an interesting trend to see.
Yeah, well, that certainly saves the travel charges, which is amazingly, it's part of my biggest budget item each year, which is I just got back from Scale, which so I paid a good amount of money for the hotel there and the flights there and things like that. And if that had all been just virtual for me, and what's funny is because I didn't want to exceed my exposure, I only went to 2 of the 4 days. So here I was actually physically on site. And I didn't go to 2 of the 4 days just because I didn't want to, increase my exposure. Because, the last thing I want to be is a carrier to go and take the disease other places. So I'm generally pretty healthy. I mean, considering how much I travel, I'm amazed I don't get more sick just because I'm constantly in big metal tubes flying at 30,000 feet. And hang out with people. Although I do have a slight bit of a cough. I hope that's not picking up the disease. We'll see. The most ironic thing, though, is I just saw this item in the news. There's a coronavirus conference that got canceled because of the coronavirus.
So first I have to ask, who thought it was a good idea to have an in-person coronavirus conference?
By the way, all these links will be in the show notes, so we'll give that to you, so you don't have to try to figure out or Google for all this stuff. But yeah, that's. I also know that one of the shows I was offered to go to because of my status as a Google developer expert, GDE, is Google I/O, and they were offering to fly me to Google I/O, and it got canceled, so it's now just virtual. So that'll be interesting to see that online instead of actually flying down there.
So Randal, what do you think about virtual conferences? What's your opinion on a conference going virtual?
There's a lot that happens in the hallway track that would all disappear. I mean, part of what I enjoy about going to OSCON and Scale and things like that is that I get to bump into people in the hallways and just have random conversations, or bump into people at the the dinners or the bars or whatever, and there's a lot of spontaneous stuff that happens there that's really hard to define, and that's not going to happen if what you have is a focused broadcast of we're showing room 7 now on the main feed. That won't be happening. Even if you have interaction in the chat room about it, it's still not going to be the same. So I think we're going to lose out on some of the progress in humanity because of this. But on the other hand, if we avoid killing a few more people. That might be a good thing.
Well,
yes. I think if more people survive because we're only having virtual conferences, I think it's probably a good thing. And I look forward to the day where we say coronavirus is sort of mastered. We're good. We're beyond it. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, despite what our commander-in-chief is saying. I think we're still a ways away from that, and I think we're still I think we're still going to have to be watching out for things. I really hope, and I mentioned this already on my Facebook thread. I did a thread called Coronavirus 12 Monkeys Discuss. It was like, it was like, are we living that movie out now? Is that how it's working out? I hope not. I really hope not. I really hope that this sort of calms itself down before we get to the point where, 60% of the population is infected. It's just a little scary to me, but I do appreciate that people are having the wherewithal to cancel conferences, make them virtual, and I'm going to miss the camaraderie. I know that my friend Captain Neil is having problems because the next cruise ship he has, people are canceling on his show, and including some of his speakers. So he's scrambling to try to cover that, and that's going to be trouble for everybody who's in the travel industry. I just booked a trip a week and a half from now to go back down to Tijuana, mostly to pick up all my stuff I left there. And so I'm like, okay, I'm risking being in a metal tube again with people at 30,000 feet. Only because I also know that it doesn't seem to have hit Tijuana yet. So I'm probably okay getting there. And I was a little worried a couple days ago because I was going from LA to Portland in a big metal tube, and I was like, okay, am I going to pick anything up while I'm there in LA or here at Portland again, or somewhere in the plane in between? But like I said, I for some reason I've been pretty impervious to various diseases, and I've been exposed to tons and tons and tons of different people all over the world, actually. So I'm pretty sure I've got a pretty good immune system, so I'm staying in pretty good health. So we'll see.
The tequila kills the virus, right? Tijuana should be fine.
I don't know that tequila kills everything. If that was the case, I would be sort of impervious here as well. So, but no, but tequila definitely has this advantage. It's an alcohol cleanse from the inside. Yes, definitely. It is. What's this open source collaboration tackles COVID? What's that about?
Oh, so this is something new. This is something that just came across my radar. It's a group of people. I think they're mainly medical researchers that said right now there's not a good body of information about how to test for COVID-19. And so let's put a group together and see if we can put essentially an open source project together with information and maybe even instructions on testing, maybe even an open source test kit on how to test for COVID-19. And I think the group's only been in existence for 10 days, so there's no actual results to look at yet. But I thought it was interesting because there's people trying to take the open source mindset mantra and apply it to these different things like medicine. And I think that's just really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting things about just in general open source, because it's a collaborative thing. And it really sort of embodies what people do with medical research, is that they share these ideas and be able to build on each other's research. It's really important that we be able to do that. So that's it's clever. It's also sad because it turns out that there's enough stuff being done, sort of this proprietary stuff. I mean, you take a look at the cost of diabetes medicine, that it's now going through the roof at the point where some states are actually putting caps on how much insulin can cost. And if we had like an open source version of insulin, maybe we could keep that down. So I don't know. We live in interesting times. And, of course, we don't have a real medical system in the U.S., which is another whole scary topic. But let's not get really distracted by that. Let's not get distracted. Yeah.
So there is an example. It's interesting you mentioned insulin. There is an example of another open source group that is kind of taking on one of these medical problems. It's been around for years and years. People that have type 1 diabetes and have insulin pumps. There's a group that said, well, we're not supposed to, and I think technically the FCC says they're not allowed to. Not the FCC, the FDA says they're not allowed. Well, the FCC may say it too. I don't know. Says you're not allowed to do this. But this group of hackers basically said we can reprogram our own insulin pumps, and rather than waiting 30 days to get a new program from the doctor, we can take our blood sugar and punch it in right then. And they're called loopers. Basically, they close loop. And they turn their insulin pump from a tool that tries to catch a butterfly with a battle axe into a homemade virtual insulin producer like their body is supposed to. And doctors aren't allowed to tell people that they can do this.
Right.
It may be technically illegal to do this. But man, it is such a change of what your life looks like for someone with type 1 diabetes when they come across this information, and so long as they do it safely, it's a radical change for someone, and it's all because of, again, this open source mindset.
What scares me is that this is slightly off topic, but since we talk a lot about security with you, is the idea of Wi-Fi enabled body devices. That they're hackable and people can remotely program them, hacking into them. It's like, I remember being in a conversation with, I forget his name. Something Brown. And he asked me, would you put an implantable device in your brain? And I said, absolutely not. Especially if it's Wi-Fiable, because people will hack into it. I don't want to do that. And he goes, why wouldn't you want that? I go, because I don't want people to hack into me, and then I would, over the years, I've been sending him clippings when I find them of people who have hacked into various, network-enabled devices. And he goes, you were right. You were right. People could do this. I go, that's exactly what I was saying a decade ago when you first asked me the question. Why I didn't want to have some device in my brain. Stephen Ewan Cobb, that's his name. So yeah, I want to make sure he gets credit for that. He wrote a couple really good books. Met him at DragonCon actually many years ago. But he couldn't figure out why I didn't want an implantable device in my body, even if it would enhance me. And I said, no, because it's too easy to hack. It's too easy to hack. It's bad enough having something running Windows up there. Yeah, sorry.
Just wait for the first ransomware attack that hit something embedded in people's bodies.
Oh, I know. So this is why I'm concerned about all this stuff. I'm concerned that we don't understand enough about computer security. We definitely don't understand enough about computer security. To build devices. I mean, we can't even build light bulbs that aren't hackable. It's like it's just crazy. Anyway, I do have a lot more to talk about, but before we do that, I do actually have one more important message to read, because this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Most of us like to browse the internet without the rest of the world knowing what we're doing. Speaking of all that, we all know about incognito windows and browsers, but did you know that even in incognito mode, your online activity can still be traced? Even if you clear your browsing history, your internet service provider can still see every single website you've ever visited. That's why you should never go online without using ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN makes sure your ISP can't see what sites you visit. Instead, your internet connection is rerouted through ExpressVPN's secure servers. Each ExpressVPN server has an IP address that's shared among thousands of users. This means everything you do is anonymized and can't be traced back to you. ExpressVPN also encrypts 100% of your data with the best-in-class encryption, so your information is always protected, even when you're using public Wi-Fi like at a cafe or hotel. Use the internet in confidence from your computer, tablet, or smartphone. ExpressVPN has you covered on every device. Simply tap one button and you're protected. ExpressVPN is the fastest, most trusted VPN on the market. It's rated #1 by TechRadar, Wired, The Verge, and others. Protect your online activity with a VPN that I trust to secure their privacy. Visit my special link, expressvpn.com/floss, and you get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/floss. expressvpn.com/floss to learn more. And we appreciate ExpressVPN for their sponsorship of Floss Weekly. So what's next on the list there?
Well, if we want to talk about it, there have been more security problems, speculative execution problems in both Intel and AMD chips. Want to dive into that?
Sure, let's do it.
All right. So first, there's one in Intel where it's possible to instead of reading from memory that you're not supposed to be able to read to, someone discovered that they could write to memory they weren't supposed to be able to write to, and speculative execution happens, and data was able to be exfiltrated from secure enclaves inside of the Intel chips. There's a bunch of terms and buzzwords we kind of need to define here. We'll start at the end and we'll work backwards. So secure enclave, that is an Intel idea. You see it in some other chips as well, but it's an Intel idea of there's something here that we need to be extra super careful with. Maybe even the kernel itself shouldn't be able to read this data. And so you can write an application where your encryption keys go in a secure enclave. Maybe the encryption keys for an encrypted virtual machine are inside this secure enclave. Things of that nature. And someone discovered that, well, this secure enclave, we can get into it using speculative execution. Well, what's speculative execution? Well, it's the idea that to get these processors running as fast as they do now, they execute things out of order, or so you have to think about source code. If you have an if statement, you have a branch, and so your execution can go, if such and such is true, your execution goes one direction, and if such and such is false, your execution goes another direction. And what the processor does is, while it's waiting for that value to settle essentially to true or false, it goes ahead and it executes down both branches, and then if it becomes true, it unwinds the false branch and jumps ahead to the true branch where it got to an execution, and vice versa. And back a few years ago, someone discovered that speculative execution changes the internal state of the processor, generally speaking, by loading things into the processor's cache. And it's subtle, and it's not something that you're intended to be able to discover, but through some different timing attacks, it's possible to learn things about that internal state. And so this was Meltdown, this was Spectre, and basically it's the idea of we can attempt to read, and the processor will, in a speculative execution mode, it will do that read, and that read will load things into cache. And then the processor will discover, oh, wait, this process wasn't supposed to have access to that read, and it unwinds it, but that data is still in cache. And then there's really the clever part of it, I think, was that they then went from the cache and tried to access based on that data that they did have access to. And then, let's see, how did this go? And then from the thread where they actually had access to it, they then once again accessed that data and did a timing lookup on essentially the data that they're trying to access. How long did it take? And one chunk of data is going to be significantly faster to access. And that gives you information about what's over here in this area of memory that you weren't supposed to be able to access, but the processor did in this speculative execution mode.
Now, I want to say this enclave is also in like the iPhone, and it's one of the reasons that Apple couldn't release some data that the FBI wanted.
So it's a similar idea. Apple over in their iPhones and their processors, it does have a secure enclave. It's the same term. I'm not sure exactly how related the two technologies are.
Okay.
I mean, obviously they're both kind of getting at the same idea. But as far as this story goes, there's not a whole lot in common, I don't think. But anyway, with this one, someone basically took a look at this upside down and backwards and said, rather than trying to read, what happens if we write data? And I haven't done a deep dive into exactly what's happening here with these Intel chips, but I know there's quite a few of them that are covered, and it lets somebody look into this secure enclave. And so, it would let an attacker do something like, if they get access to a hypervisor and there is an encrypted virtual machine running on that box, they can potentially get the encryption keys and get into the virtual machine, even though, the Intel documentation says that should be absolutely impossible.
Wow. Okay. So what's the downside of this, and is there a protection against it?
So the protection against it historically, well, there's two ways to go about trying to protect from this. One is redesigning your chips so that you protect against these kind of attacks, which Intel has done some of that. And I believe the absolutely bleeding edge Intel chips are not vulnerable to this latest attack. And
okay, so it's only if you're using older chips then, right?
Right, but we're not talking about super old chips. Like, and I don't have the information in front of me. I'm not seeing it in the article here, but it's, if you're using something older than say 9 months, then you might have this problem. And so that represents a lot of the servers out there in data centers are at least that old.
Well, it's like my laptop is like 2 years old, so I imagine it would be vulnerable to this.
Yeah, probably.
Wow.
And then the other way to mitigate against this, and this is what we saw with Spectre and Meltdown and all of the speculative execution attacks since then, is you've got to do special things in the kernel to overwrite all of this caching every time you do a context switch. So every time you go from running kernel code to running user code and then going back to kernel code, you've got to essentially flush all of your cache out. In some of the attacks, it's been flush the cache lines, or
so part of the
just
problem,
make sure.
Part of the problem is that you're up against what's efficient versus what's secure. And that's always been a trade-off over the decades. It's like, what's easy is not necessarily what's secure.
Yeah, and the thing with this, though, is we didn't realize, Intel and AMD as well, didn't realize that this was a trade-off in processors. Because we're talking at a lower level than what code runs. We're talking essentially on the microcode that the processor is running, and these subtle state changes that happens inside the processor that, by design, code is never supposed to be able to get at. And so there was never, as far as we can tell, beyond 5 or 6 years ago, whenever the first attack was released, there was never a consideration of, somebody might be able to make a timing attack against what we have loaded into cache and learn things from it.
Right.
So, it's kind of a brave new world where we're starting to look at, all of these hacks that we have in these processors to make them execute faster, there is potentially a security downside to it. And we're still, Intel, AMD, and I'm sure ARM is to the same extent is trying to figure this out. Where does this acceptable balance lie? And what does the next generation of this kind of attack look like?
Is it still true that there's like a full operating system running inside the chips, like CPM or something? I remember reading that somewhere a long time ago.
Oh, yes. So both Intel and AMD chips, one of them actually has an ARM core embedded in their chips. I don't remember if that maybe both of them actually use an ARM core. And I think Intel has been talking about actually changing that and using a RISC-V core. But yeah, they've got a little tiny core inside of each of those chips that's not even x86 that does things like power management and some of this security code. There was a really cool hack that I wrote up. This has been a couple of years ago now, where someone discovered that I think it was I think it was VIA chips, which, that's kind of the third x86 processor maker, had one of these little cores embedded in it. And there was a way to execute code on that core. And so this guy discovered a way to jump from user land directly into like this ring -1 area where he could run ARM code on this x86 chip. It was just the craziest thing. It's ridiculous. I'll have to dig that up and put it in the show notes because that's a really cool story.
Great. Yeah, cool. Sorry for distracting you, but I remember reading about that somewhere. Yeah. Okay. So and then, is that it on that topic, or are we moving on? We have a bunch more topics. I don't think we're going to get to all of them. Okay.
I will mention that AMD has not been hit nearly as hard by these speculative execution attacks. And a lot of people have suspected that that's because more people have been looking at Intel chips, at AMD chips. And based on this newest article, that seems to be the case. A couple of attacks, but they're both based on this idea of, what gets loaded up into cache and what the chip is predicting. And AMD chips from 2011 all the way up to now, today, have this potential attack that can leak information out. And so it looks like AMD is going to have the same problems. It's just a matter of going out and finding them. Wow. So one funny thing about this one, load reload, collide plus probe, and load plus reload. Those are what the two attacks are called. People have been pointing out that in the paper there's this little footnote at the end saying, "We thank Intel for their for their monetary support of this research."
Oh, nice.
So Intel got tired of being the only ones getting hit by these and said, "Hey, why don't you guys? We'll give you some money. You guys go see if you can find something in AMD chips."
Nice. Yeah. Cool. All right. So what's next?
So this one is interesting because it ties into what's, I believe, next week, as we're talking about F-Droid, next week or the week after.
Yep.
It's mobile privacy apps. So apps that are supposed to be giving you VPN service and doing ad blocking. These closed source applications are actually spying on your Android and iOS device and sending all that data up to the corporation that is making the applications.
Eek. So it's exactly the opposite of what it's trying to promote. I mean, it's basically saying I'm private, but in fact, it's actually shipping data somewhere.
Yes. So there's this company, Sensor Tower. It's a firm that bills itself as the leading provider of market intelligence and insights for the global app economy. And they've done what a lot of these companies have done. They've spun out and started, little sub-corporations, wholly owned corporations that are security and privacy corporations. Well, nobody realized that they were actually owned by marketing firms. And so you've got the two AdBlock Focus and Luna VPN are the two applications that this article from Ars Technica mentions, and they are. Yeah, they may block ads, and yes, they may give you a VPN, but they are also stealing all of your data. Not passwords, assumably, but your browsing data and all of that metadata that would be nice if it stayed just to you.
I use a couple of different VPNs, and I'm hoping that neither of them are in this category. But is there any way to know an exhaustive list of who's actually doing this?
Well, the two short answers are use open source software, which is what's really cool about the F-Droid store. They only put, and we'll talk to them here in a couple of weeks, and they'll tell you all about this. But F-Droid only has software that you can download that is fully open source, and they will even do I'm sure it's a very surface level, but they will do a real quick audit to make sure that it's not doing things like this. And then the other answer is use open source software and roll your own VPN. Run something like OpenVPN or WireGuard and just, put it on your laptop, put it on your home router, and roll your own. And that way that nobody is spying on you.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, cool. And let's go on to the next topic then. AMD hiring another open source developer.
This is really cool. So AMD, we'll stop bashing them for security problems, and we'll start praising them for their open source drivers of their stuff, their components. Specifically, here it's graphics cards.
Okay.
So we're talking mainly about Linux here, but a lot of these drivers do make their way over to OpenBSD because, both are Unix, and so there's some compatibilities there, and some of the source code gets shared. Back years ago, trying to run a video card on a Linux box was just an exercise in pulling your hair out. I mean, there was proprietary drivers, but they generally were terrible. And AMD made this decision several years ago that they said, rather than running all of this as our own closed source proprietary driver, let's start re-implementing this open source in the kernel. And they did, and it took a couple of years, obviously, for that project to come to fruition. But there is now excellent support for these video cards in the Linux kernel for AMD video cards. And AMD apparently is having so much success with this that they are looking for another high-level kernel dev that they can hire, put on their payroll, and basically point at these devices and say, go dive into the kernel mailing list, go dive into the code, and make this support better. And I think it's great to see a big company like this going out of their way. And it makes sense for their business model too, but going out of their way to support the open source, not just open source software, but the open source drivers that make it all work.
Wow, cool. Well, that's good to hear that open source is being more and more embraced by traditional proprietary companies, especially when it means more stuff is available. I remember there was a huge issue, a dozen years ago, where the video driver people would give you a binary blob that you'd have to insert into your kernel in order to be able to actually talk to their video card. And it's nice to see that that's now all coming back around as open source.
Yeah, and there is still, to some extent, a bit of a binary blob in there in the form of firmware. But that's way less onerous than saying, hey, you need to patch your kernel with this binary thing that you can't look into and you don't know what it's doing, and it's running with kernel privileges, and it can crash your computer at any time. Just trust us. No thanks.
Awesome. Well, let's go on to the next thing because we're almost out of time. So let's try to see if we can get through all the rest of these topics here. What is exFAT?
exFAT, that is Microsoft's fancy new hard drive format. They've got the file allocation table FAT. They've got NTFS. The exFAT is their newest and best and shiniest file system. And interestingly, exFAT is one that has been covered by patents for the last few years. And so places like the Linux kernel and the BSDs kind of had to say, thanks, but no thanks. We can't touch that because of the patent issues. And what's really interesting is in the last couple of years, I think it's about a year ago, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation and the open. There's a patent group, like an open patent initiative or something. And they've joined these places, and they've then committed, and they said, look, we're going to add our patents to your pool of open patents. And so a lot of things have gotten opened up because of this, but one of the things is exFAT. And so Microsoft has intentionally said, hey, we're going to make it legally possible for Linux and the BSDs to have drivers to access exFAT file systems. And then, so somebody started working on one, and a driver for exFAT, and it was kind of terrible. And then Samsung came along and said, hey, we happen to have this, because of their work with Android, we happen to have this exFAT driver that's in pretty good shape. Let's just add it to the Linux kernel, since Microsoft now says it's okay. And so you've got, again, it's kind of the same deal. You've got these two big, huge companies that are coming to Linux and the BSDs and saying, it'll just make our lives easier if we just open source all of this and put it right in the kernel. I think it's amazing.
Nice. Yeah. That's really slick. Definitely slick. Okay. A couple more items before we run out of time here. So right to repair.
I was hoping we would get to this, and this is the other side of the coin. I'm going to call out a big company here that is not doing this right, and that is, of all the places, John Deere. Yellow and green, they make the tractors. They make the tractors. Sure. They make the food that we all eat. John Deere puts proprietary code into their tractors, and it makes it such that a farmer cannot repair their own hardware. And there's been this big fight, mainly out of the United States heartland. Nebraska is where this particular article is out of. These farmers that basically said, look, it is the most ridiculous thing for our tractors to turn themselves off because of a firmware issue. And then we have to wait 8 hours for a technician to come out, plug his laptop into it, and reset the codes. And from what I understand, John Deere is using laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to bind the hands of these guys and say, well, no, we have copyright on this stuff, and we have intellectual property protections built into it. You can't do anything yourself because you aren't, an authorized vendor. And so these guys, these farmers, their hands are tied in being able to work on their own equipment, and it's terrible. And they had this piece of legislation that they were trying to get into the Nebraska State House to look at, to say, look, ownership really does mean ownership. And regardless of what any other law says, if we own a piece of property, a tractor, we have the right to work on it. And unfortunately, that particular law got killed before it got voted on. Ooh. But as a result of that, it's picking up a little bit wider press, and more people are beginning to understand the problem. But there's some interesting second order effects, we could say, or interesting applications of this. If we get a law that says you really own your hardware and you have the right to repair it, well, that's going to apply to a place like Apple as well. And Apple is real interested in being the only people that work on their hardware. So this is an interesting one for more than just John Deere tractors and farmers in the middle of Nebraska.
Yeah, and it's either an intended or unintended consequence of the DMCA too, which has really been a thorn in lots and lots of different decisions over the last 25 years, where it really messes up the ability for me to really own my data, own my experience. And actually, Phoenix Warp 1 in the chat room says tractors have code now. Are you saying tractors are Tesla level equipped? So I don't know that that's what that actually means, but there's definitely, there's firmware in my Camaro that I'm sure I can't do anything with, because I don't have access to, the programmers for it, the analysis tools for it. I know there's like the OBD1 that I can plug in and it can kind of do some of the stuff, but there's really a lot of, everything is so much smarter now. I mean, I'm sure there are microwaves and blenders that have programming in them that I can't fix, I can't change, I can't modify. And this gets to be a problem of we've moved out of a hacker universe where people can just manipulate things, because back before there was firmware in cars, you could go in and tweak the carburetor or whatever, right? And tune it. You can't do that now. You have to be able to get into the actual firmware and make it better. And are we going to keep moving in that direction as we start embedding more and more software as firmware into devices?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this is it is easier to put a tune. That's what the kids call it these days, to tune a car, a brand new car, than it is one of these tractors. It is pretty common to put a chip or just do it straight through the OBD-C port and reprogram the firmware in your car to squeeze out a few more horsepower. But if you try to do that to one of these John Deere tractors, well, one thing, apparently, most of them have a SIM card and a little cellular chip underneath the seat where that tractor is calling back updates to Papa John Deere. And so they would be aware of that pretty quick and apparently have come after a few people for doing it. And then the other kind of weird thing about this is the thing that breaks the most often on these tractors is their emissions stuff. So, especially these diesel engines, the laws about emissions are not to get political here, but they're a little onerous from time to time. And so you get things happening on these tractors, like they get too cold at night. And when you go to first start them up in the morning, maybe the catalytic converter is not working the way it's supposed to because it's not warm enough yet. Well, the firmware sees the emissions on it is not up to spec and kills the tractor until an authorized repairman can come out and troubleshoot the problem and get it started again.
Ew.
Oh, it's terrible.
That's no good. All right, one last story, and then we're going to do my wrap-up.
If we have one last story, let's talk about Let's Encrypt. This is one that kind of hit me. It's really interesting. Let's Encrypt. It's the last one on the page here. Let's Encrypt made a mistake. They goofed, and they sent out a message to like 3 million of us back a couple of weeks ago. And they said, hey, we accidentally did this thing where we issued a bunch of certificates that maybe we shouldn't have. And because the way it's not law, but it's the agreement between the certificate issuers and so the certificate authorities and the browsers, they kind of get together and they pass this regulation that controls the way SSL certificates are supposed to get issued.
Right.
And Let's Encrypt has this kind of internal policy that we check your domain and that check is good for 30 days. And so if you go to get a certificate for this domain and we've done this check within 30 days, we don't have to repeat it.
Right.
Well, there is a thing inside of certificates now that is a CAA, a Certificates Agent Authority, I think is what it stands for. And essentially it's a flag in DNS that you set and you say, hey, for example, Komodo is the only company that I want to ever issue a certificate for this domain. Mm-hmm. And so it's a neat idea. It's there for security. But when they wrote this spec, they wrote and they said 8 days. If you do this check and then you issue a certificate and then you go to issue another certificate for the same domain, it's within 8 days. You don't have to do the check again. But if it's any longer than that, you've got to run this check a second time. And there was a bug in Let's Encrypt software that said they looked at this and they said, well, okay, so there's this time period between 8 days and 30 days that we've got to run this one particular check again. But the software messed the check up. And rather than checking all of the domains, they checked one domain multiple times. So if you were getting a certificate that had 3 domains, which is pretty typical for Let's Encrypt certificates, and you had this field set in your DNS, rather than checking the first one and then checking the second one and checking the third one, they check the first one and then they check the first one again and they check the first one the third time and then issue the certificate.
No, okay, yeah, that's no good.
So obviously there's a bug there, but I think they looked at it and there was like there were just a handful. It was quite a few less than 445. There were 445 certificates that they issued that they shouldn't have issued. And so, and then there were like 3 million of them in total that were issued while this bug was in place. And because of the way that this specification was written, they are required to go through and invalidate all of them. And so Let's Encrypt sent out this email to, a bunch of people and said, hey, in like 5 days, we're going to invalidate these 3 million certificates.
Wow.
And suddenly, every server administrator everywhere's hair is on fire as they're running around trying to make sure. Well, so they got to the deadline and they discovered that all 445 of the actual problematic certificates had already been taken care of. But there was like 1.7 million certificates that had not been updated. So if they were to revoke them, they would just flat out break these websites.
Oh.
So Let's Encrypt said, oh, well, okay, we feel like we have a little bit more leeway here. We're going to give you guys something like 30 days. And that's where it's at now. But I thought the whole saga was weird and interesting. And it's interesting because it's Let's Encrypt. And so they're really transparent with all this stuff. And we kind of get a view into the inner machinations of how all this is working.
Yeah, there's many ways to do this wrong, and they did it wrong. Interesting.
Well, they did one thing. They did one thing wrong, and then it's really interesting to watch how they're trying to recover from that mistake and trying to do all the other things right. And I gotta say, I really like Let's Encrypt. I think there's some great people there working on it, and I really like being able to, again, their transparency in this, to be able to look into it and see what's going on and the steps that they're taking.
Well, and providing a way for everybody to have an SSL cert that for free, which is really nice. It's we didn't have an easy way of doing that more than like 5 years ago, so it's very cool that they're doing that. We're out of time. It's been wonderful to be chatting with you for. I didn't believe we would have like an hour's worth of news, but we actually ran out of time. We actually had 2 other stories we could have covered, but I appreciate you bringing all the topics you brought to today's show, and it also stepping up when we had the little snafu with our guest, and hopefully we won't have another one of those snafus in the future. We'll figure out ways to make sure my email doesn't end up in their spam box, which is, we've had that twice now before, which is really sad. It's like I send out ordinary email and then they never see it because it ends up in their spam box, which is, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. It's the same mail I've been sending out for 13 years, and all of a sudden it's been ending up in people's spam boxes. But anyway, we'll figure that out. Anyway, so like I said, we're out of time. I want to talk about who's coming up. Next week, we have XS Code, which is to turn your open source project into a steady revenue stream. That sounds promising. Boy, if I could do that with everything I'm doing, that would be great. Aganis, something like that, which is to host and run and scale dedicated game servers on Kubernetes. Speaking of Kubernetes, F-Droid, which you mentioned a couple times in this show, F-Droid is an installable catalog of FLOSS, free and open source software applications for the Android platform. The client makes it easy to browse, install, and keep track of updates on your device. Hydra, which is your reschedule, because, again, Hydra was supposed to be on an earlier show, and somehow they never got my email, so now they're moved down. Hopefully they'll get the email for the upcoming show. It's a framework for elegantly configuring complex applications. PIMCore, which just got added last week, creates frictionless, personalized customer experiences on top of your master data across all channels and touch points in real time. I'm certainly going to want Simon Phipps on that show. I have a feeling that is a huge open core project. We'll see. Just added to the list, XCP&G, based on a request from one of our listeners, is a turnkey open source hypervisor. That should be fun. Also added, based on a request from our audience, Contractor, which is a builder of anything and is targeted to be used as a generic API to create, destroy, and manipulate your resources. So no matter where or what they are, this enables you to focus on what you want to make and not have to worry about the details and differences in deployment. Again, for the entire schedule and who's we're working on and who, if you see somebody that's not on that list at twit.tv/floss, that's our big the homepage for this show. There's a link from there to our big spreadsheet. If you have any other suggestions, please tell the project leader or community coordinator to email me, especially if it's not about cryptocurrency. Oh, we didn't mention Bitcoin this time. Sorry, Bitcoin. All right, here we go. Done. All right, had to mention it once for the chat room. Bitcoin. Maybe did twice. Okay. We have a live stream, which we took a couple questions from, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays at live.twit.tv. You can also watch us behind the scenes, see what kind of mistakes we make. You can follow us at FLOSS Weekly on Twitter. You can follow me at Merlin on Twitter, Merlyn. We have a forum at twit.community. We have a special dedicated channel there, and you can post questions there, and I will watch for those and try to answer them if I can. So there hasn't been a lot of questions yet, but anyway, it's kind of cool. I don't have anything to plug right now. I just came back from Scale. I'm going to be down in Tijuana next weekend, but probably people won't see me there. I don't really have any. I have a couple conferences coming up. I have OSCON coming up in Portland. I also have the Pro Conference in, I think it's Austin, Texas this year. Is it Austin? No, it's Houston. Houston, Texas. Same thing, right? No, not entirely. And
you just offended millions.
I know. But they're not near here, so it's okay. And what do you want to plug there, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll mention two things. So both of them are actually Hackaday related. First off, I get to also co-host the Hackaday podcast later today, and that'll go live in a couple of days, I think. And then I've got the normal Friday morning security column where we'll dive deeper into some of these topics that we discussed today. So if you didn't get enough information about the AMD and the Intel bugs and all of those things, check it out on Friday. I will have done my homework even more thoroughly by then, and we'll talk about it again.
Cool. And again, thank you for stepping up the last second and covering for the snafu that I had with not getting email to my my guest today. But we'll get him back on. We'll put it back on. It'll probably end up at the end of this list. But so it'll probably be sometime in May or April, whatever is coming up next after that. Must be May because we're already up to we're all the way through April already. So yeah, okay. Anyway, so that's been fun. Again, I'm using my not so good camera, but I'm using my great mic, so that's the important thing. I've got my Blue Yeti, so I'm happy with the sound. I'm not so happy with the picture. I don't have my Fez. My Fez is in Tijuana, but I'll get to that in a week and a half when I get back down there. And that's probably all I've got to say, so we'll see you all again next week on Floss Weekly.